Welcome to Whispers of the Night. This is Adam, your host for today's mystery. In this episode, a daring break-in at the Royal Mint sets off a chain of secrets, deceit, and betrayal. And at the heart of it all, one clue that gleams brighter than gold itself. Before we begin, I'd love to hear your thoughts. How are you enjoying these mysteries so far? And where are you tuning in from? Please let me know in the comments. Your feedback truly shapes what comes next. And don't forget, all these newly released episodes will be available for our members right away and completely ad-free. If you'd like to join and enjoy ad-free videos, the link is waiting in the description. Now, pour yourself a cup of coffee, settle in, and let's get started. The Robbery at the Royal Mint. Chapter 1. The Summons. The fog that settled over London on that November morning in 1935 seemed to wrap itself around the very foundations of the empire, muffling the sounds of the great city, and lending an air of mystery to even the most mundane of streets. I had risen early, as was my custom, and was enjoying a leisurely breakfast in my flat when the telephone rang with an urgency that immediately set my nerves on edge. "Hastings, thank goodness you're there." The voice belonged to Inspector, though it carried none of his usual gruff confidence. Instead, there was a note of barely concealed anxiety that made me sit up straighter in my chair. "What's the matter?" I asked, setting down my cup with a slight rattle against the saucer. "Can't say much over the wire, old man, but we need Poirot, and we need him now. Are you able to reach him?" The gravity in his tone was unmistakable. "He's here, actually. Shall I put him on?" No. Better if you both come down to the yard immediately. And Hastings, not a word to anyone about this. The matter is, well, let's just say it touches on national interests." Within the hour, Poirot and I found ourselves seated in Inspector Japp's office, the familiar surroundings made somehow more somber by the grey light filtering through the grimy windows. Himself looked as though he hadn't slept, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of strain. "Gentlemen," he began without preamble, "what I'm about to tell you must not leave this room. 3 nights ago, there was a theft at the Royal Mint." I felt my eyebrows rise involuntarily. The Royal Mint, the very fortress of Britain's monetary system. Poirot, however, merely adjusted his cufflinks with characteristic calm indeed. "And what pretell was taken?" £200,000 worth of newly minted gold sovereigns," replied grimly, "from a sealed vault that has never been breached in its entire history." The magnitude of the theft was staggering, but it was Poirot's next question that cut to the heart of the matter. "And you are certain it was theft, mon ami, and not some administrative error?" Japp's expression grew even more grave. "Quite certain. The gold was there at the evening inspection on Tuesday. By Wednesday morning, the chest contained nothing but lead replicas. Perfect in every detail, mind you, but worthless as anything but paperweights." "Lead replicas," Poirot murmured thoughtfully, his green eyes taking on that distant look I knew so well. "Most interesting. And the security arrangements? That's just it. They're impeccable. The Mint operates like clockwork. Every man vetted, every procedure followed to the letter. No one entered or left the building during the night in question. The guards are beyond reproach. The locks untampered with. And yet the gold has vanished." Poirot finished softly like smoke in the wind, nodded heavily. "The Treasury is beside itself. If a word of this reaches the press, the scandal will be enormous. The confidence in our currency, our banking system, all of it could be shaken." I found my voice at last. "But surely with such elaborate security measures, there must be some record, some trace of how it was accomplished." "That's what we're hoping can tell us," replied. "We've questioned everyone with access to the vaults. The Deputy Master, Sir Lionel Gresham, is cooperating fully, though he's naturally distressed about the breach occurring so close to his retirement. The Security Chief, Captain Denham, has provided us with detailed reports of the night's activities. Even the night watchman has been thoroughly interviewed." Poirot had been listening with the intense concentration he brought to all matters of criminal investigation. Now he leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled before him. "This Salion Gresham," he said quietly. "He is retiring soon, within the fortnight actually. Been with the Mint for over 30 years. Brilliant man by all accounts, though perhaps a bit, particular about his methods. And Captain Denham, war hero. Distinguished record, though he's had some financial difficulties recently. Nothing that would compromise his position, mind you, but enough to cause him personal distress. The fog outside seemed to press closer against the windows as Poirot absorbed this information. I could see the familiar signs of his mind engaging with the puzzle, the slight tilt of his head, the way his fingers moved almost imperceptibly, as though organizing invisible pieces on a mental chessboard. "We shall need to visit this mint," he announced at last, rising from his chair with characteristic decisiveness. "To see with our own eyes this fortress that has been breached without being breached, this vault that has been robbed without being entered." As we prepared to leave Japp's office, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to enter a world where the very foundations of order and security had been quietly undermined. The fog swirled around us as we descended the steps of Scotland Yard, and I found myself wondering if the mist that clouded London streets had somehow found its way into the heart of Britain's most secure institution. The Royal Mint awaited us, its secrets locked behind walls that had seemingly proved no barrier at all to someone with sufficient cunning and audacity. Chapter 2. The Fortress. The Royal Mint presented an imposing facade as our taxi drew up before its gates. Built of solid grey stone that seemed to absorb the weak November sunlight, it stood like a monument to British financial might. Austere, dignified, and apparently impregnable. The very air around the building seemed charged with an atmosphere of mathematical order and rigid discipline. Inspector had accompanied us, his usual bombastic manner subdued by the gravity of our surroundings. As we approached the main entrance, I noticed how the fog seemed to cling to the building's corners, as though even the weather conspired to shroud this place in mystery. "Impressive, is it not, Hastings?" Poirot murmured as we passed through the security checkpoint. "A place where precision is not merely desired but essential, where the smallest error might cost the nation dearly." Our first introduction was to Sir Lionel Gresham, the deputy master of the Mint. He received us in his office, a spacious room whose every surface spoke of decades of meticulous organization. The man himself appeared to be cut from the same cloth as his surroundings, tall, distinguished, with silver hair, perfectly groomed, and a bearing that suggested both authority and intelligence. "Gentlemen," Sir Lionel began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of a man accustomed to addressing matters of national importance, "I cannot adequately express my distress at this violation of our security. In 31 years of service, I have never witnessed such a breach." Poirot studied the deputy master with those keen green eyes of his. "You speak of it as a violation, Salian. Most interesting, not as a theft, but as something more personal." A slight flush colored Salian's cheeks. "The Mint is more than my workplace, Mu Poirot. It is the embodiment of order, of trust, of the very stability that underpins our monetary system. To see it compromised," he paused, collecting himself. "Forgive me. I fear I take these matters rather personally." "There is nothing to forgive," Poirot assured him gently. "Such dedication is admirable now, if you would be so good as to tell us about the evening in question." Sir Lionel's account was methodical and thorough. The gold had been inspected at 5 on Tuesday evening, as was standard procedure. The vault had been sealed according to protocol with multiple locks and the time-release mechanism engaged. No irregularities had been noted, no cause for concern detected. The discovery was made by Miss Shaw, my secretary, during the routine morning inspection, Sir Lionel continued. "I shall never forget her expression when she summoned me. The poor girl was quite beside herself. As if summoned by his words, a soft knock came at the door, and a young woman entered carrying a tray of tea. Miss Evelyn Shaw was perhaps 30 years of age, with auburn hair pinned back severely, and grey eyes that spoke of intelligence and efficiency. Her movements were precise, economical, and I noticed how she arranged the tea service with the same attention to detail that characterized everything else in this establishment. Miss Shaw, Sir Lionel said with obvious fondness. "These gentlemen are here to investigate our difficulty. Perhaps you would be good enough to describe what you discovered that morning." Miss Shaw's composure was remarkable as she recounted finding the lead replicas. Her voice remained steady, professional, though I detected a slight tremor when she spoke of the moment she realized the gold was gone. It was the weight that first alerted me, she explained, her hands folded carefully in her lap. I was conducting the standard inspection when I noticed the chest felt different, lighter than it should have been when I opened it. She paused, and for just a moment her professional facade slipped, revealing genuine distress beneath. Most observant, Poirot commented. You are familiar with the weight of these chests. I assist Sir Lionel with many of his duties, Miss Shaw replied, her composure restored. I have handled similar containers on numerous occasions. Our next interview was with Captain Hugh Denham, the security chief. He was a man of perhaps 45, with the bearing of a soldier and the weathered look of one who had seen action. Yet there was something about him, a tightness around the eyes, a slight tension in his shoulders that suggested inner strain. The security procedures were followed to the letter, Captain Denham assured us, his military bearing evident in every word. I've reviewed every detail multiple times. There was no breach of protocol, no suspicious activity, no unauthorized access to any part of the building. Poirot listened attentively, occasionally asking for clarification on technical points. And you yourself, Captain? Where were you during the critical hours, making my rounds as always? I conduct a complete circuit of the building every 2 hours. Throughout the night, everything was in perfect order. Yet someone managed to substitute lead for gold without detection, Poirot observed mildly. Captain Denham's jaw tightened slightly. That is what makes this so damnable. Excuse me, so confounding. Every security measure we have in place functioned exactly as designed. And yet the impossible has occurred, Poirot finished thoughtfully. Our final interview of the morning was with Alfred Binks, the night watchman, a ruddy-faced man in his 60 seconds. He possessed the solid reliability that comes from decades of faithful service. His devotion to the Mint was evident in every word he spoke, though I detected the faint aroma of spirits about him. Not unusual, perhaps for a man who spent long, lonely hours patrolling empty corridors. 43 years I've been here, Binks declared with obvious pride. Man and boy through 2 wars and Lord knows how many changes. Never had so much as a pen go missing on my watch. Never mind. He gestured helplessly, unable to complete the thought. As we concluded our interviews and prepared to examine the vault itself, I found myself struck by the genuine distress these people felt at the violation of their sanctuary. Whatever had occurred here, it had shaken the very foundations of their ordered world. The vault, when we reached it, was a masterpiece of engineering. Multiple steel doors, time locks, and security mechanisms that would have challenged the most skilled criminal. Yet somehow, impossibly, it had been breached without leaving a trace. Poirot stood in the center of the vault, his head tilted slightly as he absorbed every detail. The fog outside seemed to have found its way into my thoughts, clouding my understanding of how such a feat could have been accomplished, but I knew that keen mind beside me was already beginning to perceive patterns where I saw only confusion to find order within this apparent chaos. Chapter 3. The Impossible Crime. The vault itself was a testament to British engineering, a chamber carved from solid stone and reinforced with steel plating that gleamed dully in the electric light. As we stood within its confines, I felt the weight of centuries of accumulated wealth and security pressing down upon us. The very air seemed to hum with the gravity of the place. Poirot moved with his characteristic deliberation, examining every surface with the intensity of a scholar studying an ancient manuscript. His small, neat hands traced the edges of the doorframe, tested the locks, and assessed the positioning of every security device with a meticulous care. "Observe, mon ami," he said softly, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. This vault was designed by men who understood human nature as well as mechanical engineering. Every precaution has been taken against the obvious methods of entry. Inspector shifted uncomfortably beside me. That's what makes this so blasted impossible. Poirot, we've had experts examine every inch of this place. No signs of forced entry, no tampering with the locks, no evidence of any unusual activity whatsoever. Ah, but that is precisely what makes it so fascinating, Poirot replied, crouching to examine the floor where the chest had stood. A crime that leaves no trace is often the most revealing of all. I watched as my friend's keen eyes took in details that would have escaped my notice entirely. He studied the positioning of the chest, the way the light fell across the floor, even the pattern of dust that had accumulated in the corners of the vault. "See now," Poirot said suddenly, turning to address the deputy master who had accompanied us into the vault. "This inspection routine, it is always conducted at the same time each morning." "Without fail," Sir Lionel replied promptly. "Punctuality is essential in our operations. Miss Shaw conducts the initial inspection at precisely 8, and I follow with my own review at 8, and on the morning in question there was nothing unusual about Miss Shaw's demeanor before she made the discovery." Sionel paused, his brow furrowing in concentration. "Now that you mention it, she did seem somewhat agitated that morning. I attributed it to the fog. It had been particularly thick, and she mentioned having difficulty with her journey to work." Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then turned his attention to the lead replicas that had been left as evidence. They were indeed masterful forgeries, each coin perfectly weighted and sized to match the originals. The craftsmanship required to create such replicas spoke of considerable skill and resources. "These were not made hastily," Poirot observed, hefting one of the false coins. "Such work requires time, materials, and expertise. This was no crime of opportunity, Miami, but a carefully planned operation." Captain Denham, who had been silent throughout our examination, finally spoke up. "The lead content analysis suggests the metal came from a specialized source, possibly a research facility or advanced manufacturing operation. We're checking with suppliers, but so far, nothing." Grimly, "It's as though these replicas materialized out of thin air." As we prepared to leave the vault, Poirot paused at the threshold, his head tilted in that particular way that indicated his mind was working at full capacity. "Tell me," he said to Solian, "this retirement of yours, it was planned long in advance." A shadow crossed Sir Lionel's features. "The announcement was made 6 months ago." "Yes. The Treasury felt it was time for fresh blood, as they put it." There was something in his tone, a hint of bitterness perhaps, or wounded pride that caught my attention. I filed the observation away, knowing that such emotional undercurrents often proved significant in Poirot's investigations. Our return journey through the corridors of the Mint revealed the full extent of the building's security measures. Every door required multiple keys, every passage was monitored, and the staff moved with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to strict protocols. It seemed inconceivable that anyone could have navigated this maze of safeguards undetected. "The ventilation system?" Poirot inquired suddenly, stopping before a large grating set into the wall. "It operates throughout the night, on a scheduled basis," Captain Denham confirmed. "The system cycles every 4 hours to maintain proper air quality. There's an 8-minute period during each cycle when the main fans shut down for maintenance, a safety precaution." 8 minutes, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "And this occurs at what times?" "Midnight, 4, 0 inches the morning, and 8, 0 inches the morning," Captain Denham replied. "The timing never varies." I saw Poirot's eyes sharpen with interest, though he made no comment. Instead, he continued his examination of the corridor, paying particular attention to the areas around the ventilation system. As we concluded our tour and prepared to leave the Mint, Miss Shaw approached us with a manila folder in her hands. Her usually composed expression showed signs of strain, and I noticed that her fingers trembled slightly as she handed the documents to Sir Lionel. "The Treasury correspondence you requested, sir," she said quietly. "The letters regarding the transition arrangements." Sir Lionel accepted the folder with a tight smile. "Thank you, Miss Shaw. You've been most efficient, as always." The exchange was brief and seemingly routine, yet something about it struck me as significant. Perhaps it was the way Miss Shaw's eyes lingered on Sallion's face, or the careful formality of their interaction, despite the obvious familiarity between them. As our taxi pulled away from the Mint, I found myself studying the building's imposing facade one last time. The fog had begun to lift slightly, revealing more of the structure's architectural details, but the mystery within its walls seemed only to deepen with each revelation. "Well, Poirot," I said finally, "what do you make of it all? An impossible crime in an impregnable fortress." My friend was silent for a long moment, his fingers steepled before him in that familiar gesture of deep thought. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note of quiet satisfaction. "Nothing is impossible, mon ami. What we have witnessed today is merely improbable, and improbability, when examined closely, often reveals the most elegant of solutions. The taxi carried us through the grey streets of London, past buildings whose solid permanence seemed to mock the violation that had occurred within the Mint's walls. Yet I knew that Poirot's mind was already working to unravel the threads of this complex puzzle, to find order within the apparent chaos of an impossible crime. Chapter 4. Death in Mayfair. 2 days had passed since our initial visit to the Royal Mint, and I confessed that the puzzle had taken firm hold of my imagination. Poirot had spent the intervening time in what he termed reflection, which meant long periods of silence punctuated by occasional, muttered observations in French, and the methodical arrangement and rearrangement of objects on his desk. I had learned over our years of association to respect these periods of mental gestation, knowing that they often preceded his most brilliant deductions. It was therefore with some surprise that I received Inspector Japp's telephone call on that grey Thursday morning, summoning us once again to assist with what he described only as a development in the Mint case. The fog had returned with a vengeance, wrapping London in a shroud so thick that our taxi crawled through the streets at barely walking pace. The very air seemed charged with an ominous quality that set my nerves on edge, and I found myself grateful for Poirot's calm presence beside me. "Where exactly are we bound, Japp?" I had asked during his hurried telephone call. "Mayfair," came the cryptic reply. "Captain Denham's flat and Hastings, prepare yourself. This case has just taken a rather sinister turn. The building that housed Captain Denham's residence was one of those solid Victorian structures that spoke of respectable middle-class comfort. As we climbed the stairs to the 3rd floor, I noticed how the fog seemed to have penetrated even here, creating an atmosphere of gloom that was both literal and metaphorical. Japp met us at the door of the flat, his expression grave. "Found him this morning," he said without preamble. Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, became concerned when he didn't answer her knock about the rent. She has a spare key for emergencies. The scene that greeted us within was one of tragic finality. Captain Denham sat slumped in his desk chair, his military bearing forever stilled. A revolver lay on the floor beside his right hand, and on the desk before him, an envelope addressed to the Treasury in precise handwriting. "Suicide, by all appearances," continued, his voice subdued. "The weapon is his own service revolver, properly registered, single shot to the chest. And then there's this." He handed Poirot the envelope with careful reverence. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing a brief typewritten message. "I alone am responsible for the theft at the Royal Mint. I beg the state's forgiveness." The signature below was unmistakably Captain Denham's, though executed with a trembling hand that spoke of great emotional distress. I felt a curious mixture of relief and disappointment wash over me. Relief that the mystery was apparently solved, disappointment that it should end in such a tragic manner. Yet, as I glanced at Poirot, I saw that familiar expression of intense concentration that suggested his mind was far from satisfied with this apparent resolution. "The door," Poirot said quietly, moving to examine the entrance to the flat. "It was locked when Mrs. Patterson discovered the body quite securely," confirmed. "She had to use her spare key to gain entry. No sign of forced entry anywhere. No disturbance beyond what you see here." Poirot nodded slowly, his green eyes taking in every detail of the scene. He moved with characteristic deliberation, examining the position of the body, the placement of the weapon, the arrangement of papers on the desk. His attention seemed particularly drawn to the typewriter that sat on a small table near the window. "This confession," he said, holding up the document. "It was typed on this machine." "Appears so," replied. "We'll have the experts confirm it, of course, but the typeface seems to match." And Captain Denham, he was in the habit of typing his own correspondence, shrugged. Military man, you know. Probably learned to type during his service. Many officers did, especially those in administrative positions. I watched as Poirot continued his examination, noting how he paid particular attention to details that seemed insignificant to my untrained eye. The position of the desk lamp, the arrangement of books on nearby shelves, even the way the curtains were drawn, all seemed to hold meaning for him. "The weapon," Poirot said suddenly, crouching beside the fallen revolver. "It has been fired recently, this is certain. The ballistics examination will confirm it, said. But yes, all evidence points to it being the weapon used. Powder burns on the victim's clothing, trajectory consistent with self-infliction. And yet, Poirot murmured so quietly that I had to strain to hear him. Something troubles me about this tableau. Before I could ask what he meant, there was a commotion in the corridor outside. Voices could be heard, one authoritative and commanding, the other higher-pitched and distressed. The door opened to admit Lionel Gresham, accompanied by Miss Shaw, both looking shaken by the news of Captain Denham's death. "Inspector," Lionel said, his usual composure clearly strained, "we came as soon as we heard. This is absolutely dreadful. First the theft, and now this tragedy." Miss Shaw said nothing, but I noticed how pale she had become, her usually steady hands trembling slightly as she clutched her handbag. Her grey eyes moved quickly around the room, taking in the scene of death with what appeared to be barely controlled emotion. "You knew Captain Denham well?" Poirot inquired gently, addressing both visitors. "We worked closely together," Lionel replied. "He was a good man, troubled perhaps by his financial difficulties, but I never imagined." He gestured helplessly at the scene before us. "Financial difficulties." Poirot's interest was immediately piqued. "Nothing catastrophic," Lionel assured him quickly. "Some unfortunate investments, I believe, and the usual pressures of maintaining appearances on a government salary, but hardly the sort of thing that would drive a man to." Again he could not complete the thought. Miss Shaw finally found her voice. "He seemed different these past few days," she said quietly. "More anxious than usual? I thought it was merely the stress of the investigation." "Different in what way?" Pooh asked, his tone carefully neutral. "He was asking questions," she replied, then seemed to catch herself. "That is more questions than usual about procedures, about schedules. I assumed he was trying to be thorough in his cooperation with the police inquiry. I noticed the glance that passed between Sir Lionel and his secretary, brief but charged with some meaning I could not fathom. There was something unspoken between them, some shared knowledge or concern that they were reluctant to voice. As the afternoon wore on, and the various officials completed their preliminary examinations, I found myself increasingly troubled by subtle inconsistencies in the scene. Nothing dramatic or obvious. Rather, it was a collection of small details that seemed somehow wrong, like notes played slightly off-key in an otherwise harmonious composition. The way Captain Denham's body was positioned suggested he had been writing when he shot himself. Yet the confession bore no signs of having been interrupted mid-composition. The typewriter ribbon appeared to be missing, though this could have been explained by normal wear. Most puzzling of all was the fact that the door had been locked from the outside, a detail that seemed willing to dismiss as a quirk of the old building's mechanisms, but which continued to nag at my consciousness. As we prepared to leave the scene, Poirot paused at the threshold, much as he had done at the Mint Vault. His head was tilted in that characteristic manner, and I knew his mind was working to process all the information we had gathered. "A thief who confesses posthumously," he murmured, so quietly that only I could hear, "does not also lock the door from the outside." The fog had thickened during our time in the flat, and as we emerged onto the street, London seemed wrapped in an impenetrable shroud. The yellow glow of street lamps created isolated pools of light in the gloom, and the familiar sounds of the city were muffled and distorted. I knew that this apparent resolution of the Mint robbery would satisfy most observers. A man driven to crime by financial desperation, overcome by remorse, taking his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. It was a tragic but comprehensible narrative that fit the available facts. Yet, as I walked beside Poirot through the fog-shrouded streets, I sensed that he was far from satisfied with this neat conclusion. Something in the arrangement of evidence troubled his orderly mind, some discordant note in what should have been a harmonious resolution of the case. Chapter 5. The Web Unravels. The following morning brought with it a clarity of both weather and thought. The fog had lifted during the night, revealing London in sharp relief against a pale winter sky. I found Poirot in his sitting, surrounded by papers and photographs related to the case, his expression one of intense concentration. "Ah, Hastings," he said, without looking up from his contemplation. You arrive at precisely the right moment. I have been giving much thought to our Captain Denham and his supposed confession. I settled into my usual chair, noting the careful arrangement of evidence photographs that Poirot had spread across his desk. Surely the matter is resolved. Poirot. The confession seems quite clear, and the circumstances, mon ami, are precisely what trouble me. Poirot finally raised his eyes to meet mine, and I saw in them that familiar glint that indicated his mind had seized upon some crucial insight. Consider, if you will, the sequence of events, as they have been presented to us. He rose and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back in the manner I had come to recognize as indicative of deep thought. We have a theft that appears impossible, gold substituted for lead in a vault that showed no signs of breach. Then, 2 days later, we have a suicide that appears inevitable, a man overcome by guilt, taking his own life rather than face disgrace. Too neat, Hastings. Far too neat for the complexities of human nature. Before I could respond, our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector, whose usual robust demeanor seemed somewhat subdued. "Morning, gentlemen," he said, accepting the cup of coffee I offered him. "I've come with some rather interesting developments in our case." "Indeed." Poirot settled back into his chair, his attention fully focused on our visitor. "The ballistics report confirms that Captain Denham's revolver was indeed the weapon used," continued. "But there's something odd about the typewriter ribbon. It's missing, as you noted, and we can't find it anywhere in the flat. Seems a strange thing to dispose of if you're planning to kill yourself." "Most strange indeed," Poirot agreed. "And what of the financial records? You mentioned that Captain Denham was experiencing difficulties," consulted his notebook. "That's where it gets interesting. Yes, he had some debts, investments that went badly, some gambling losses, but nothing catastrophic. Certainly nothing that would justify stealing £200,000 worth of gold. And yet," I interjected, "the strain of debt can affect men differently. Perhaps the pressure was greater than it appeared from the outside." Pooh shook his head slowly. "You think too simply, mon ami. Consider the mechanics of this supposed theft. The substitution of the lead replicas required intimate knowledge of the Mint's procedures, access to specialized materials, and considerable time for preparation. This was not the desperate act of a man driven by immediate financial need." Jack leaned forward in his chair. "That's what's been bothering me as well. The planning involved, the resources required. It suggests someone with a very different motive than mere financial gain." "Precisely," Poirot said, his eyes brightening. "And that leads us to a most interesting question. If Captain Denham did not steal the gold for money, why would he steal it at all?" The discussion was interrupted by a telephone call that answered with growing excitement. When he replaced the receiver, his expression had changed completely. "That was the laboratory," he announced. "They've been analyzing the lead replicas, and they've made a remarkable discovery. The lead alloy, used in their construction, is extremely unusual. It contains trace elements that suggest it came from a very specific source, which is," Poirot prompted, "the Royal Institute of Technology's Materials Laboratory. They're located in a building adjacent to the Mint. The laboratory has been conducting research into metal alloys for various government applications." Poirot's eyebrows rose, most illuminating. "And I suppose this laboratory would have had access to detailed specifications of the gold sovereigns. For research purposes, yes," confirmed. "They've been working on anti-counterfeiting measures for the Treasury." The implications of this discovery began to sink in. Someone with access to both the Mint and the research laboratory could have created the replicas well in advance, waiting for the right opportunity to execute the substitution. "We must speak with the staff of this laboratory," Poirot declared. "There may be connections we have not yet perceived." Her visit to the Royal Institute of Technology proved most enlightening. The building, while adjacent to the Mint, seemed to belong to an entirely different world, one of academic research rather than monetary precision. Dr. Reginald Hartwell, the laboratory director, received us in his cluttered office with the beused air of a man unaccustomed to police investigations. "The lead alloy samples," he said in response to our inquiries. "Yes, we've been working with various compositions for the past 6 months, part of a Treasury commission to develop more sophisticated anti-counterfeiting measures. And who had access to these materials? Poirot asked. Dr. Hartwell consulted a logbook, the usual research staff, of course, plus occasional visitors from the Mint itself. Let me see. Sir Lionel Gresham visited several times to consult on the 12-find project specifications. Captain Denham accompanied him on at least 2 occasions. Miss Shaw, Poirot inquired. Did she ever visit the laboratory? Oh yes, regularly. She often collected materials or documents for Salionol. Very efficient young woman, always knew exactly what she needed. As we left the laboratory, I found my mind reeling with the new possibilities these revelations suggested. The neat narrative of Captain Denham's guilt and suicide was beginning to unravel, replaced by a far more complex web of relationships and opportunities. Poirot, I said, as we walked back toward the Mint, if Captain Denham didn't steal the gold, then who did, and why was he killed? Ah, mon ami, now you begin to ask the right questions, Poirot replied with satisfaction. Consider what we have learned. The theft required intimate knowledge of Mint procedures, access to specialized materials, and the ability to create perfect replicas. Captain Denham possessed some of these capabilities, but not all. Then, you believe he had an accomplice? I believe, Hastings, that Captain Denham discovered something about the theft that made him dangerous to the real perpetrator. His suicide was in fact murder, carefully staged to appear as the remorseful end of a guilty man. We had reached the gates of the Mint, and I could see Lionel and Miss Shaw through the windows of the main office, their heads bent together over some documents. From this distance, their collaboration appeared entirely professional, yet something in their posture suggested a deeper connection. The missing typewriter ribbon troubles me greatly, Poirot continued. Why remove it unless it contained evidence that contradicted the supposed confession, and the door locked from the outside? No suicide victim locks himself in and then disposes of the key. But who could have had access to Captain Denham's flat? I asked. Pooh's smile was enigmatic. Someone he trusted. Mon ami. Someone he would admit without question. Someone whose presence would not alarm him until it was too late. As we entered the Mint, for what I sensed might be our final visit, I realized that the fog which had obscured London for so many days was beginning to lift from this case as well. The truth, complex and tragic as it might prove to be, was finally beginning to emerge from the shadows where it had been so carefully concealed. The great clock in the Mint's central hall chimed the hour as we passed beneath it, each note seeming to mark another step toward the inevitable revelation that would expose not just a theft, but a murder born of misplaced loyalty and desperate love. Chapter 6. The Final Revelation. The assembled company in Salionol's office presented a tableau that would have been familiar to any devote of criminal investigation. The suspects gathered together, the detective prepared to reveal his conclusions, and the atmosphere charged with that particular tension that precedes the unmasking of truth. Poirot had requested this meeting with his characteristic insistence, and Inspector had ensured that all the principal figures in our drama were present. Salionel sat behind his desk, his usual composure showing signs of strain. Miss Shaw occupied a chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, with that studied calm I had come to recognize as her professional mask. Mr. Binks, the night watchman, stood somewhat apart, his weathered face showing bewilderment at finding himself included in such distinguished company. "Ladies and gentlemen," Poirot began, his voice carrying that note of authority that could command attention in any circumstance. "We are gathered here to resolve not one crime, but 2. The theft of gold sovereigns from this institution and the murder of Captain Hugh Denham." A sharp intake of breath from Miss Shaw was the only sound that broke the silence following this pronouncement. "Murder," Sir Lionel repeated, his voice hollow. "But surely the evidence points to suicide, the confession, the circumstances." "Ah, the confession," Poirot said, producing the typewritten document from his briefcase. "Let us examine this supposed admission of guilt more carefully. Captain Denham, we are told, typed this confession before taking his own life. Yet, when we search his flat, what do we find? The typewriter ribbon is missing, a detail that might seem insignificant, but which tells us much." He paused, allowing his words to settle in the minds of his audience. "Why remove the ribbon, mes amis? because it would have shown that this confession was not typed by Captain Denham at all, but by someone else entirely, someone who then removed the evidence of their deception. Inspector leaned forward in his chair. But who else had access to his flat? And why kill him at all if he was the thief? Because Monami, Captain Denham, was not the thief, Poirot declared with quiet certainty. He was, however, growing dangerously close to discovering the truth about who was. The silence in the room was profound, broken only by the silence, steady ticking of the clock on Sir Lionel's desk. The theft itself, Poirot continued, was a masterpiece of planning and execution. It required intimate knowledge of the Mint's procedures, access to the research laboratory where the lead replicas could be created, and the ability to carry out the substitution during that crucial 8-minute window when the ventilation system shut down. But that's impossible, Salionol protested. The security measures were circumvented by someone who understood them intimately, Poirot replied. Someone who had helped design them, who knew every detail of their operation. The theft was not the work of an outsider breaking in, but of an insider acting from within. His green eyes swept the assembled company, and I saw several people shift uncomfortably under his penetrating gaze. The motive for this crime was not greed, as one might expect, but something far more complex, a desire to prove a point, to demonstrate that even the most secure system could be compromised. It was the act of a brilliant mind driven by wounded pride and the approaching end of a distinguished career. Sir Lionel's face had gone very pale. You cannot possibly be suggesting that I am suggesting nothing, Sir Lionel. I am stating facts, Poirot replied firmly. You planned to steal the gold, not to enrich yourself, but to expose the vulnerabilities in the system you had helped create. You intended to return it eventually, after proving your point about security flaws. It was to be your final gift to the institution, a demonstration that would ensure reforms were implemented after your departure. The deputy master's composure finally cracked. How could you possibly know? Because mon ami, the theft was too perfect, too considerate of the institution's reputation. A real criminal would have simply taken the gold and disappeared. Only someone who genuinely cared about the Mint would have gone to such elaborate lengths to create replicas, ensuring that the theft might eventually be reversed without permanent damage. Miss Shaw had risen from her chair, her face a mask of anguish. Sir Lionel had nothing but noble intentions, she said, her voice trembling with emotion. He wanted only to protect the institution he had served faithfully for 30 years. Indeed, Poirot agreed gently, but Captain Denham discovered the truth, did he not? He realized that his superior was the one responsible for the theft. Perhaps he intended to confront Sir Lionel privately, to persuade him to confess and return the gold, but someone else could not allow that conversation to take place. All eyes turned to Miss Shaw, who stood frozen by the window, her carefully maintained composure finally beginning to crumble. Captain Denham came to you, Miss Shaw, Poirot continued, his voice soft but inexorable. He had worked out the truth about Salionol's involvement. Perhaps he even showed you the evidence he had gathered. You realized that if he spoke, the man you had served so faithfully would face disgrace and imprisonment. He was going to destroy Salion, Miss Shaw whispered, her voice barely audible. Everything he had worked for, his entire reputation. Captain Denham was going to throw it all away for the sake of following regulations. So you went to Captain Denham's flat, Poirot said. He admitted you willingly. Why would he not? You were Salionel's trusted secretary, someone he had worked with daily. You brought with you a confession that you had typed in advance, one that would shift all blame to the dead man and away from your beloved employer. The room was silent, except for the sound of Miss Shaw's increasingly labored breathing. The rest was simple enough, Poirot continued. Captain Denham was armed as befitted a former soldier, and you knew where he kept his service revolver. A single shot, the weapon placed in his hand, the confession left on his desk. And then you locked the door from the outside, using your knowledge of the building's old mechanisms. You cannot prove any of this, Miss Shaw said, but her voice lacked conviction. On the contrary, Poirot replied, reaching into his waistcoat pocket, I can prove it quite conclusively. He produced a small object that gleamed dully in the afternoon light filtering through the office windows. A gold sovereign, he announced. Found in your desk during our investigation. Genuine, not a replica. One of the stolen coins that you handled during the creation of the false confession. In your haste to protect Sir Lionel, you overlooked this single piece of evidence. Miss Shaw sank back into her chair, all fight leaving her. Sir Lionel moved toward her with an expression of horrified understanding. "Evelyn," he said softly, "what have you done?" "I could not let them call you a thief," she replied, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "You gave your life to order, to discipline, to this institution. I could not bear to see it all destroyed by that man's rigid adherence to duty." The tragedy of the situation was palpable. A woman's misguided devotion leading to murder, a brilliant man's pride resulting in theft, and a good soldier's sense of duty costing him his life. As Inspector moved to make the necessary arrests, I found myself reflecting on the complex web of human emotions that had led to these crimes. Pride, love, loyalty, and duty, all admirable qualities in their proper place, but capable of such destruction when twisted by circumstance and poor judgment. The fog that had shrouded London during our investigation seemed finally to have lifted, revealing the truth in all its tragic complexity. Justice would be served, but at a cost that touched everyone involved in this sorrowful affair. Epilogue. The autumn rain was pattering gently against the windows of Poirot's flat as we sat before a cheerful fire, the events at the Royal Mint now several weeks behind us. The newspapers had carried brief accounts of the irregularities discovered at the institution, but the full truth of what had transpired within those greystone walls remained known only to those of us who had witnessed it first-hand. "A most melancholy affair," I remarked, setting down my brandy and gazing into the flames. "When one considers the waste of it all, Sir Lionel's brilliant career ended in disgrace. Miss Shaw facing trial for murder, and poor Captain Denham dead for the sake of duty." Poirot nodded slowly, his own glass untouched on the table beside him. "Indeed, mon ami, it is a case that demonstrates how the noblest of human qualities can, when misdirected, lead to the most tragic of consequences." The fire crackled softly as we both contemplated the complex web of motivations that had driven the participants in this drama. Outside, London continued its eternal rhythm, but within these comfortable walls we found ourselves wrestling with questions of morality and justice that had no easy answers. "Tell me, Poirot," I said after a moment, "what first made you suspect that Captain Denham's death was not suicide?" My friend leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in that familiar gesture of reflection. "Several small details troubled me from the beginning. Hastings. The locked door was significant, certainly, but more telling was the absence of the typewriter ribbon. Why remove such evidence unless it contradicted the narrative being presented? And Miss Shaw, when did you begin to suspect her involvement?" "Her reaction to Captain Denham's death was most revealing," Poirot replied thoughtfully. "She displayed the correct degree of shock and distress, but there was something beneath, a quality of relief that suggested she was not entirely surprised by the turn of events. Then there was her intimate knowledge of the building's mechanisms, her access to both the mint and the laboratory, and above all her obvious devotion to Salional." I sipped my brandy, considering his words. "It seems almost incredible that love could drive someone to murder." "Ah, but love is perhaps the most dangerous of all human emotions when it is unrequited and obsessive," Poirot observed. Miss Shaw had spent years in Salion's service, watching him, caring for his professional needs, perhaps harboring hopes that were never to be fulfilled. When she saw his reputation threatened, she acted not with rational thought, but with the desperate passion of a woman protecting what she held most dear. And Sionel himself, what of his motives in orchestrating the theft? Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. Sionel's case is perhaps the most tragic of all, for his intentions were not dishonorable. He genuinely believed he was serving the institution he loved by exposing its vulnerabilities. Pride certainly played a role, the pride of a brilliant mind being forced into premature retirement, the desire to leave one final mark upon the world. But at its core, his plan was born of genuine concern for the security of Britain's monetary system. The rain continued its gentle percussion against the windows, creating a soothing backdrop to our conversation. I found myself thinking of the various players in this drama and wondering what their fates might ultimately be. "What news do you have of the aftermath?" I asked. "Sionel has quietly resigned and retired to his cottage in the Cotswolds," Poirot replied. "The Treasury, recognizing the validity of his concerns about security, has implemented many of the reforms he advocated. In a strange way, his crime may have served its intended purpose, though at a cost far greater than he ever imagined, and the gold recovered in its entirety from a concealed compartment within the mint itself, exactly as Solion had planned. He intended to discover it after a suitable interval, thus demonstrating the inadequacy of the search procedures as well as the storage security." I shook my head at the complexity of it all. A scheme that might have worked had it not been for Captain Denham's investigation and Miss Shaw's misguided loyalty. Precisely. Sir Lionel's plan was methodical and well-conceived, but he failed to account for the human element, the reactions of those around him when faced with the apparent evidence of his guilt. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, each lost in our own thoughts. The fire had burned lower, casting dancing shadows on the walls of the familiar room. Finally, I felt compelled to voice the question that had been troubling me most. "Do you think justice has been served in this case, Poirot?" My friend considered this carefully before responding. "Justice, mon ami, is a complex concept. Miss Shaw will face trial for murder. This is the justice of the law. Sir Lionel has lost his career and reputation. This is the justice of consequence. But is there justice for Captain Denham, who died for the crime of being too honest, or for Miss Shaw, whose devotion led her to commit an act she would never have contemplated under other circumstances? You speak as though you have sympathy for the lean, criminals in this case." "I have sympathy for the human condition," Poirot replied gently. "Each of these individuals acted according to their own moral code, however misguided. Lionel believed he was serving a greater good. Miss Shaw believed she was protecting an innocent man. Even Captain Denham, in his determination to expose the truth, was following the dictates of his military honor. None of them set out to commit evil. Yet evil was the result. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed the hour, its measured tones reminding us of the passage of time and the inexorable march of consequence that follows all human actions. Perhaps I suggested the true lesson of this case lies not in the crimes themselves, but in understanding how good people can be led astray by their strongest virtues. "Ah, Hastings," Poirot said with a slight smile, "you begin to sound like a philosopher. But yes, there is wisdom in what you say. Pride, love, duty, all admirable qualities that become dangerous when they override judgment and compassion." As the evening drew on, and our conversation turned to other matters, I found myself reflecting on the strange alchemy by which the basest crimes could emerge from the noblest intentions. The Royal Mint had been violated not by greed or desperation, but by pride and love, emotions that, in other circumstances, might have led to great good rather than great harm. Outside, London slept beneath its blanket of autumn rain, secure in the knowledge that its monetary system remained sound, its institutions intact. Few would ever know how close they had come to a scandal that might have shaken the very foundations of public trust. The fog that had shrouded the city during our investigation had lifted, but the moral complexities it had concealed would linger long in the memory of those who had witnessed them unfold. "Theft and murder," Poirot murmured as we prepared to retire for the evening, "are but twins of vanity. One steals gold, the other steals a name. Thank you for listening to the robbery at the Royal Mint here on Whispers of the Night. This tale reminds us that sometimes the most precious things aren't the ones stolen, but the truths we try to hide. If you enjoyed today's story, please give it a like, share it with fellow mystery lovers, and don't forget to subscribe for more timeless tales. Until next time, stay curious, stay sharp, and may your evenings always be filled with good stories and warm company. This is Adam, signing off from Whispers of the Night.